Hello, everyone. I'm Curtis Daly with Turn Left at the Media Democracy Festival. I do apologise for us being late. We had the amazing. So this is our first live show with brilliant Tom Mills. Now, if you don't know who Tom Mills is, you should do. But Tom Mills released a book. What is it? You released a book actually on the BBC.
Originally 16,
Yeah.
first edition, and then there was a revised edition.
I'm sorry about that, but this is typical left-wing audio, left-wing tech issues. I do hope you can hear me. We've got someone monitoring the comments to see if we can, and it seems like we're okay so far. Yeah, we're all good. So I'm going to start that again. I'm with Tom Mills. Tom Mills is the chair of the Media Reform Coalition, which helped put this festival together. Now, I want to talk about your book quickly, The BBC, The Myth of the Public Service. You said it came out a few years ago, then there's a revised edition.
Yeah. So it originally came out 2016. So I wrote it, I guess, just before the sort of referendum and then Corbyn period, and then just as sort of beginning of the rise of Starmer, I guess. Like, so I'm just trying to think myself like what the particular periods were. But yeah, so that was a revised edition. So, but a lot of the content, which is historical, was basically the same. Although in like the follow-up version, I had a different introduction and started to develop various ideas about how you could reform the BBC, which I've been sort of developing over the years since the first edition came out. But yeah, a lot of the content's the same, but the second edition was 2020. So,
Okay, so I mean, there's going to be part of this stream with yourself. I think there's going to be two angles I'm going to approach this. The first one is going to be talking about the BBC historically and today, and then new media. Okay, so you wrote the book on the BBC. For those who haven't read it, what's the premise of the book, and what went wrong with the BBC?
Okay, what's the premise of the book? I would say like the basic thesis of the book is that the BBC isn't actually independent from the centres of power in society, and there's lots of different ways that I approach that. the sort of headline aspect of it, which actually I think is probably much more familiar to people now than it was when I originally was researching and writing the book, was these various mechanisms of political control that politicians have had. But I also cover different elements like the BBC's relationship with the business elite and the BBC's relationship with the secret state, the Foreign Office, and so on. So we tend to think of the BBC as being this like very sort of independent. Um, uh, the book's called The BBC Myth of a Public Service. It's not
Mm.
really about public service, the BBC being a myth. It's really about the BBC's lack of independence and impartiality. So, what I try to do in the book is show how lack of independence then impacts on the BBC editorial culture, and then that impacts on what you see on the TV screens, on the radio, of course, online, and all the rest of it. So, it's really creative, some really like romantic ideas about what the BBC is and what it does, and it just tries to describe the BBC in reality as the BBC is and how it has been. Now, the second part of the question was what went wrong with the BBC. Well, actually, the thing is, like one of the arguments that I make in the book is that the BBC has gone through this profound period of change. That's very important in the book, describing particularly how the BBC changed from the 90s onwards, becoming a more commercialized organization. Actually, and particularly during the 1980s, so the story which is more well known, where the BBC's independence become eroded. But I traced the BBC's history back further than that and showed that really any kind of like radical break you want to see at the BBC, it had resistance in the outset. That the BBC was never really independent of power. Its culture has changed significantly. Its business model has changed significantly over that time. But I think the idea that there was this wonderful BBC that existed in the past and that we need to go back to that again, it's overly romantic. At the same time, in the book, I try and show that actually the BBC from its very earliest years existed in sort of grey area between an out and out sort of state broadcast and a genuinely independent organisation. That's the overlying argument, right? And then it shifts backwards and forwards at different times. The key change, I argue, was really the commercialisation of the BBC in the 1990s. So one of the stories I tell in the book is about the BBC's relationship to the business elite, how it understands markets, how it understands neoliberalism. That went through a really profound sort of shift. But the stuff I started talking about, sorry, it's very long. So, the stuff I started talking about, which is really the BBC's relationship with the state, that's been the BBC since like since early days.
You talked about the culture shift, right? I think one of the biggest, and you talk about in your book, apologies for that again. We promise we're going to try and make this the last one. But this is what happens when you're a bunch of volunteers in independent media. Maybe I should just plug us. So if you guys want to check out, still not working, post it. Oh, I bet you're sick of this. So obviously there's the issue of our audio equipment. And if this happens again, what we're going to do is just record it all. Gone. How are you, Mike?
No.
What's the comment saying? We live? Okay, so I think this is the last time we're going to try and do a live. We've changed our backup. We've changed our backup audio system. How are we doing, producer? We still getting audio? Still sounds pretty good. If this does go wrong, then we're gonna have to go to pre-recorded interviews. Again, this is what happens when you do everything on a budget. But we don't have any money behind us, so maybe you could go to turnleftmedia.co.uk/support and maybe pitch a monthly donation. That's all I can say. I'm really sorry to mess you out, Tom, but
No, it's fine.
hopefully it sounds like we might be okay. Um, the question I left off, I know people might just have just joined the stream, but we don't want to rehash everything. What I will say is the question I had to you about the BBC,
Yeah.
there was a culture change you mentioned, right? But in your book, you talked about a big change, which is Thatcherism.
Yeah.
Can you delve into that, please?
Yeah, a lot of the histories of the BBC, like this is actually probably the period that which is most talked about actually in terms of like the BBC's culture, but particularly its relationship to the government. And that's because most accounts of the BBC basically see it as operating independently, apart from when there is direct political pressure applied from politicians. And what happened during the Thatcher period was that the government was much more willing to directly criticize the BBC. There were clashes between the BBC and the government over some of its programmings. There was cuts to the BBC's funding, and Thatcher also introduced several political appointees to the board. Now, the tradition had been previously that you would kind of have this like bipartisan consensus in when you're appointing what was then the board of governors, and basically the Tories just threw that out and decided to gradually fill the board of governors, which was the ultimate sort of authority within the BBC with their supporters. And then eventually this culminated in forcing the resignation of the then Director General Alistair Mills. So this period has been like talked about quite a lot actually in other accounts of the BBC, and it was very important. It's when the BBC became much more politicized, when the government was much more willing to put the BBC under pressure. Some of that returns later under the subsequent Tory government. Really start. I mean, the period that's talked about most has been Boris Johnson, but I mean, really, we can see a similar sort of pattern with George Osborne's treatment of the BBC. What was the aspect which actually hadn't been quite as well understood, to my mind, when I was writing the book, was that then what happened after Thatcherism? Because for me, really, the key point about what the BBC went through during the Thatcher period was that then the period of change that the BBC then goes after Thatcher. It goes through a period of like intense marketisation. But when Alistair Milne gets kicked out, essentially the Director General being kicked out on his arse at the behest of the government, what they do is they bring in a new Director General. He's not terribly important, actually. The more important person that they brought in was a guy called John Burt, and he later becomes Director General of the BBC. Now, this guy was a neoliberal, like in the very sort of narrow sense of the word. I know there's lots of people who say, oh, neoliberalism, you know, what does that even mean? I mean, he was literally hanging out at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's very, very explicit about
famous
this.
IEA, we all know them, don't we?
Yeah. So this was the birthplace of Thatcherism, right? And the thing is with somebody like John Burt, and it wasn't very well understood at the time when people were writing about the BBC and Thatcherism or Thatcherism in general, was that you could be sort of socially liberal and then committed to marketisation and attacks on like the public service ethos, all of that stuff that was like very, very central to the neoliberal project. Burt was 100% signed up to that, and he's very explicit about it actually in his biography. And when he takes over the BBC, he does a couple of things. One, he makes it much more managerial and a much more authoritarian organization. But when people were writing about this at the time, they were sort of saying, oh, you know, this guy's sort of at the left in some vague sense. So they were sort of calling him a Leninist or a Stalinist or something in that sort of Cold War fashion.
We get that with the BBC today. They'll say it's a left-wing institution. It's always got a left-wing bias, which is, I mean, I think maybe on some aspects, whether it's culture or maybe immigration, they could be a bit more liberal. But when it comes to the economy, for example, it's fully on. I mean, I would say it was very Blairite, in my view. That's a really interesting point there. I mean, even back then they were calling him a leftist.
Yeah,
when it's
they
clearly not
sort of didn't
true.
really. It's okay. So they didn't. It's definitely related to that point, but it was kind of like they didn't really know what to do with somebody who was like pro market but socially liberal, right? And that's a kind of political type that we completely recognise now, right? It's Tony Blair, it's David Cameron, and the rest of them. But at that point in time, they saw Thatcherism as being that hard right sort of cultural agenda and the pro market agenda. So when Bert comes in the BBC and he becomes much more authoritarian, much more managerial, but also much more pro market, they just don't know what to make of it. But actually, if you see what was going on in British society around that time, exactly the same thing was being rolled out like across the public sector. You had a shift towards like pro market policies at the same time as this sort of like maddening sort of quasi-market bureaucracy starts to develop. So all that was going on at the BBC, and at the same time as the BBC's culture was shifting under Bert, they were also investing in business journalism. It's a very specific way of understanding the economy, and that replaced a previous way of reporting the economy, which was kind of like, oh, we understand the economy as something which is supposed to provide jobs for people, right? So primarily, when you had a story on a big company, it would be like, what's the impact going to be on the economy? What's the impact going to be on jobs? And there was a very explicit attempt to shift the BBC's political reporting in the 1990s. So I think, like, insofar as I have an original contribution, I mean, hopefully there's lots of original contributions in the book, but in terms of like a long-term understanding of the BBC, that was where I started with the book, was like understanding how that culture worked through the BBC, how that changed, and how it was, because really when I started getting interested in the BBC, it was around 2008. It was the time of the financial crash. It was understanding, why does a public media institution report on business in such a like maddening, like uncritical fashion? And so it was trying to tell that story, and several of the stories which hopefully help us understand like why the BBC does what it does.
Well, I mean, that's very interesting you say it, because one of the points in your book, and obviously a lot of people have documented this, is that once upon a time, I know we don't need to romanticize the BBC, but once upon a time, you did have two voices: the voices of capital, the voices of labour. There was a trade union correspondent or labour correspondent. That's now gone, and it's very much, you can say, very pro business, but there isn't that sect for collective bargaining or workers' rights. Even mentioned jobs.
Yeah.
Even in that context, it's like, well, I mean, and this is why we talk about the economy, I suppose. When we talk about the economy, we talk about growth and how it's good for businesses, but we don't see how it is for the workers. So there is a big shift there as well, that there's been little focus on labour and unions and all focus on capital.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, they had, I guess the way we'd be thinking about it would be a sort of, sort of small c conservative social democratic model of reporting, which was basically like, what does the CBI say? What do the unions say? What's the dispute going on? Now, a lot of that reporting was quite bad, right? Because actually, like, they tended to report everything as just like as a sort of mysterious dispute, and no one really knows what's going on. And often it was the workers who were being blamed for like various kind of economic problems in the 1970s. I mean, this was like the pioneering work of the Glasgow University Media Group. But as you say, there's a recognition there that the economy is a sphere where different interests can compete, right? But not only that like people can be addressed as workers, not merely as consumers. And the effort to shift like the BBC's culture, and by the way, this was a cultural shift that took place across the British media and the media globally. That was a very explicit project. I mean, one of the things I did with the book was like to look at accounts from the time, but also contemporary documents of how these things were being described, to interview people who had been around. This wasn't some like mysterious change that was taking place. There were specific people appointed saying, we need to be more pro-business at the BBC. We need to be investing in reporting the businesses as being a good thing, right? And Bert, who said, we don't need these trade union reporters anymore. The unions are not relevant. They're not a story anymore. And the reason they weren't a story was that like Thatcher had smashed them, and they were only important from the perspective of like sort of elite political reporting, insofar as they had that disruptive potential, right? So as soon as they sort of lack that political foothold into the Labour Party, suddenly there's a sort of sense of, oh, these people aren't relevant. Well, then what was the consequence of that for like the BBC's reporting? As you say, it meant that there were like we never have a whole world of experience, and a whole perspective just completely disappears from like a public broadcaster, and that affects how we understand the economy and understand like our place in the economy.
Okay, so let's talk about the present then with the BBC, because obviously that's a very brief history of it, and how the power inside it changed, and the context around it. But I want to ask you, do you still think we can use the BBC? Can we save the BBC? Are you in that camp, or are you now in the other camp, which is, I would say, it probably transcends political allegiances, that we should do away with the BBC altogether?
No, I don't think we should do away with the BBC. I mean, I think that the starting point for this is like, do we want publicly funded media? Okay, so like, I think in a sense, like the question about how people relate to the BBC is a slightly separate question. We could have this discussion on the level of like, okay, what media do we want? How do we want it to be funded? Now, there's a separate question of, do we abolish the BBC, right? Now, for me, like, I think the problem with this conversation on the left is that, like, I completely understand, like, people who are socialists, and I'm a socialist myself, feeling a lot of hostility towards people at the BBC, particularly the leadership and particular influential figures at the BBC. And I understand the hostility. But the thing is, the question of how bad the BBC's reporting is on Israel Gaza or on the Labour Party or whatever, or on the environment, that's not the correct issue. That's not the correct question which you should be asking. It's not a question of how much the BBC winds you up. It's not a question of how bad you think this reporting is. For me, the question is, what kind of structure of public media do we want? Right. So I start from the place of how should we be what do we want public media to do? How should we fund that? And then from that, I take the position that if we abolish the BBC, that would make things worse because it would strengthen the hand of private media, and it would weaken various kinds of sort of professional values, which I think can be quite useful as a very limited counterweight against some of that stuff. But the question for me isn't whether we should keep the BBC as it is, because if that's the question, I think absolutely not. Like the current model of the BBC is absolutely unsustainable. But the question is, like, what kind of structure do we want at the BBC? Do you want to keep public media? And I think we want to keep the BBC for various reasons. Like, it has lots of cultural weight. It has huge resources, and admittedly, it is like been slowly torching its public reputation for like the past couple of decades, but still does command a certain amount of respect, like domestically and internationally. So, my project has always been take the BBC. And try and make it into what it actually claims it is, which is an independent media organization. But what I don't want it to do is become completely independent of the public. Because basically the BBC's current model is accountability towards like political elites or politicians and established interests. I don't want the BBC to be completely independent. I want it to be accountable to the public and to the audiences that it serves. So recently, Dan Hind and Tom Chivers and I wrote a report on the BBC called Our Mutual Friend, where we talk about how the BBC can be changed from this sort of quasi-state broadcaster that we've been discussing towards an organization which is owned by everybody in the UK, and we as members become actively involved in the BBC's operations and how it fulfills its public purpose. Now, sorry, that's a very long answer, but the underlining point is that I think we don't want to lose what we want from the BBC. We want to take seriously what are the structural problems that lead to the bad reporting, and how do we address that? That's what my argument has always been.
No, I mean, that makes sense, because obviously if you were to turn around and say, let's abolish the BBC, then all you essentially have is corporate media, and that doesn't fix the issue. I think, I mean, there's two separate things. So there's policy, and then there's what I would say was what's politically popular. And I think it will be, and I'm not saying this is it's not advice or anything for the left, but how do we as the left sort of navigate this hostility towards the BBC? It comes from the left, it definitely comes from the right, and we're saying, don't worry, we're the guys in touch, but we want to keep the BBC.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that?
Yeah, well, you've got to maintain the critique, haven't you?
Yeah.
Like, this is the thing, like, the left, like, in very broadly defined, I mean, I'm thinking more sort of the Guardian reader left types here, like, have always been defending the BBC based on a total fantasy about what the BBC is. You know, and it's the same with academics. You know, often, you know, when I started talking about the BBC, you'd be having conversations with people and you just realize, but like the BBC you're describing not only does it not exist today, it's like it's just never existed. You know, like in a sense, like what I was trying to do with the book was like just realistically describe what the BBC is and what the BBC does, and so that has to be based on the actual reality of what the BBC is. The key thing I was trying to do with the book, though, is like understand what are the structural drivers leading to what we see on the TV, right? So I'm slightly repeating my previous point here, but like you can say what the BBC does is awful, right? And it's reporting on Israel-Palestine, for example, right? But I don't see that you then go from that to abolish the BBC. Where the next step is, why is its reporting so bad, right? Why is it? Why does it do what it does? And therefore, if you start to understand the BBC better, what goes on behind the scenes, the BBC that we don't generally see, but the BBC that you can reach by ethnography or archival research or doing interviews, then you get some sort of sense. Okay, under the bonnet, there's some other stuff going on. That's where the left needs to be, under the bonnet, thinking about how could we change the BBC so it does something different. Now, your question was more political, is like, how do you navigate that very difficult space? And I think the only way you can do it is from a completely critical perspective. And really, to me, there's not so much difference between being critical and being realistic. You know, people see the way the BBC reports now, and it's simply not sustainable for the left to defend bad journalism, obfuscation of obligations to like very basic like professional values. I mean, you know, we could have a very long conversation about impartiality, but I don't think anybody serious thinks that the BBC has upheld impartial reporting on like key issues in the last 20 years. So foot in the door, you've got to be realistic about what the BBC does. And then you need to offer a structural critique of those underlying problems and say, okay, we're not defending the BBC, we're defending the principle of public service media, and we think if we had a different type of the BBC, if we could transform it, then the BBC would be able to do this better, you know. But yeah, it's as I say, it's been a sort of like liberal left position to try and defend the BBC, and basically the position is the BBC's good, Murdoch's bad, don't say anything bad, otherwise the BBC will be abolished and then everything will get worse. I mean, you know, there's a grain of truth to that. Like, it would get worse if the BBC was abolished, but they've been on the back foot now for like 30 years, and it's got us nowhere, basically.
You're right. My first question was political, which is why I did want to lead into the second question, which is the policy. So, what are the main things? Maybe it's just three of them. Maybe there's more. What are the main things you want to see that changes within the BBC to really, in a sense, save it? Because obviously, if it carries on as it is, it probably won't survive for much longer, or at least its credibility will be severely reduced. But what are the main things you would like to see about the BBC change? But also not just the BBC, but the wider media. Let's be honest, it's not just the BBC that's the problem. It is corporate media, as we briefly touched upon.
Okay, I think corporate media is really quite a separate question, and it comes back to this issue of like, is there a difference between how bad the media reports and the question of like what we should do about that? Because the bad thing, the things that lead the BBC to report badly, are amenable to change. Like, whereas in the case of the corporate media, these are profit-based institutions. They are not reformable. Like in their like fundamentally in their current structure. So the BBC is, right. So the question is, what leads to the bad reporting? And they're well known. Okay, so like you get the socio-cultural background of the people who work there. Clearly, you need more diversity, but it's not about sort of diversity in terms of like just ethnicity, gender, and class background. You also need to think about the levels, right, at which people have influence, because the BBC is a very hierarchical institution. You can't just have, you know, diversity across the organisation. You've got to have it into key roles. That is important. That's now recognised by the BBC. That's widely recognised. It needs to be taken away from the centres of power in London. You can't have a fundamentally London-centric institution and not expect it to be like, you know, captured by elites. And that some of that's gone on, right? So you've had the BBC moving out a little bit. For me, like the fundamental stuff though is first of all, governmental control, governmental influence over the BBC, which comes from the form of appointments to the board. It comes from the form of control over the license fee that we've not really talked about very much, and it comes over control over the charter renewal process. This all needs to go. Like, you can't have a public independent media which is in the end compromised by its relationship to Downing Street. I mean, it's a complete contradiction. So all of that needs to go. And then we get to the more substantive question of if you get rid of that like formal mechanism of political accountability, who is the BBC going to be responsible to? And for us, that means it has to build a closer relationship to members of the public. And
one model that people have suggested is, you can have a form of like democratic control at the BBC. But what Dan and other Tom and I have argued is that for lots of reasons, that's not a very good model for a large media organization. And what we suggest instead is that members get randomly selected to populate panels, boards within the BBC, which have authority over how the BBC conducts its journalism and influence how it approaches like cultural production as well.
That's really interesting. It's almost like a jury service in a way.
It is like a jury.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because basically the origin of the jury form is that like you have people who are, your peers that are able to make judgments. And we say, well, look, we take that ability to make judgments informed by expert opinion as proxies for the public. Now, the reason why we think this is a more effective mechanism is that if you have election to, let's say, boards at the BBC, and it's like a democratic process like we're used to, a representative democratic process, that just gets captured by like the very people who already control Parliament. So you end up having a much more messy politicization of the BBC. We do want to politicize the BBC in a sense, right? We want people to pass political judgment about what the BBC does, but we want ordinary people to be able to do that, to avoid exactly the kind of capture of the formal political system within the organization itself.
I just want to say, what's the time we're on? Because I think we've overran. It's about 1:10 because we're technically doing our second live streaming show now. So I think if we could possibly go to like a quick break, and we might have to swap out a guest. Tom, that was really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
I read your book. I loved it. I need to read it again though because it was a few years ago now, and obviously there's been new editions. I really like this idea of a more democratic BBC, but one in some of the models you've been suggesting. I think they're really good, really well thought out, and you provide a very cohesive argument as to why the left shouldn't fall into the trap of let's just get rid of the BBC, even though we feel very, very angry with it, and sometimes you think they deserve it.
Yeah, that's right. People are right to be angry, but then the question is, what do you do with the anger, right?
Well, that's very true. But Tom, thank you so much for spending time with me today, and thank you for coming to Turn Left at the Media Democracy Festival. If we go for a quick break, we're probably going to go straight into our second live stream because obviously we've ran over due to tech issues, of course. But we'll see. We'll keep you updated. But if you cut us off onto a graphic, that'd be fantastic.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Sarah Delau with Turn Left, and we're at Media Democracy Festival. So, a super exciting day with so many amazing speakers and being able to delve into their work. And I'm joined by the amazing Lexi. Could you just introduce yourself kindly to everyone that's watching?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lexi Kirkconnell-Kawana. I'm the Chief Executive of Impress.
Yes. Super exciting actually, because I'm a big fan of Impress. It's obviously the only independent press regulator. And I think a lot of your work, when I've read into you and I've read into things that you've authored and stuff, you do so much work when it comes to anti-racism advocacy and like press freedom. And I think the things that are fundamental to just the press in general, given the media organizations that we're around at the moment. But what I find really interesting is your contribution to the demos report. Drivers of digital discord. Could you delve into that a little bit further for those that maybe haven't looked into that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many.
Yeah,
this is
true.
it's really difficult. So I'm a systems thinker, and I
Yeah.
often think about there are these various nodes that have interactions that lead to the
Mhm.
kind of media effects that we have here in the UK. And when we think about, for example, from an anti-racist perspective, we do have a racist media in this country.
Agreed.
We have a media that deprioritizes representing voices. I'm not saying individual people at individual organizations. I'm saying systemically,
Absolutely.
and then elevates, a majoritarian view that prioritizes those interests and those issues at the expense of true representation. Not even kind of additional representation in a reparatory sense, but true representation. We don't have that in the labour force. We don't have that in the reporting, and we don't have that in what's published in the agenda setting. So when we think about what are all the different aspects of our media system that leads to that outcome, we start having to like pull threads at a really big tapestry, and then when we take that even further, we go, so what are the consequences of a racist media in the UK? The consequences are the types of social discord that we see now, and that bleeds out into all aspects of our digital lives, because that's the originators, the progenitors of the agenda that then sets out, right, so how do we think about social spaces online? How do we think about how that affects our education systems, our healthcare systems, our justice systems, all that sort of thing. So when I talk about drivers of digital discord, I'm thinking about what are those kind of epistemic things and the effects, and I think it starts with the storytelling. So the story of what is the story of Britain, and who gets to tell that story, and when that story is told, what are the effects on us as part of that oral history?
Yeah, absolutely. And I quite like that you mentioned epistemic injustice, because that was going to be one of my questions. Because we know that obviously about the systemic exclusion almost of certain voices, particularly those that come from marginalized communities. I think we're seeing it so much more so when it comes to trans voices, but even when we think about intersectionality, so like the different intersections that people are having to, I think the barriers they're having to like experience when it comes to accessing certain services, accessing certain sectors. And you speak so much about epistemic injustice. So it's not just about representation, but also about centering the lived experiences of those in those spaces. So what sort of challenges do you come across when you're trying to get the lived experiences or the voices of those at the forefront in the things that you write about?
I mean, and that's really interesting. I can speak about it in two ways. I can think about it in a theoretical way, but I can also speak about it in an experiential way, what we do in my organization, right? So I'm an organization, I have a team of people, and I have committees that sit around that, and we have the activities and functions that we do. Am I able to build a representative body of people that do that work? I can try and do that as a chief executive of an organization. I can develop policies and procedures to try and give that to effect. But I also just have to recognize the limitations, right? I'm not going to be able to ensure that every single person, working in my organization represents all the different kind of nodes of diversity, and also as well, do I think that that's going to have the net effect of producing, representative and just outcomes? That's to be tested. So what do I do is I think about it as a function, as an ethic of my own practice that I then expect of the publishers that we work with. And the way that we've done that is what I call this co-creational model of regulation, which is to say we're not the experts in everything, but we are these vehicles for representation, for different views to come in and define what they want the standards of journalism and reporting to be. So when we've done that work, when we built our standards code, when we built our regulations, we went out to the community and we asked for their mandate to reconcile all of their views and what's become our code and our code of practice. And so that meant us doing the work, doing the footwork of going out and reaching organizations that maybe didn't trust us, organizations that we had to go and find. We didn't expect them to come to us, and that meant talking with hundreds of organizations, hundreds of experts, doing surveys with big population studies, but then also recognizing that in population studies you get these weird anomalies statistically, particularly with minoritized communities. So then going, right, so let's do a focus group with 40 people that come from ethnic minority backgrounds, because we know that there's going to be that imbalance in how they're represented in quantitative research. So it's all of that work and all of that practice, and that is a values driven one, because there's no one telling us that we had to do that. We just believed that that was the right thing to do. And so that's at a practical level what we do as an organization. And my expectation is to practice what you preach. And so when I talk to news publishers and news media, I'm saying this is how we can do this stuff. You can come up with your own methodology, but the point is to do that. At one level, having a really pluralistic media is one way to achieve that. But I think every news organization should be thinking about that stuff as well.
Yeah, completely agree. And I'm thinking of like where that, because it's very, very grassroots. So where that gets situated in what sometimes does feel like an oversaturated space. And I love how distinct and unique Impress is, because you are wanting to center the community at the forefront of what you do. And I think that's like a pivotal thing that makes journalism work and stuff. But how can regulation kind of support those grassroots efforts and that community media? Like, what could be done to make sure that sort of thing isn't lost within Impress or within like just media as a whole?
So for me, this is all about having really good governance in place. And so yes, I'm a regulator, a lawyer by background or legal trained by background. And I do believe in rule sets. I don't necessarily believe in following all the rules all the time necessarily, but I believe in rule sets because I believe that, it's a good way to organize activities and to make sure that they have legacy and that they endure, right? Because if I left my organization tomorrow before I went under a bus, it's like, how do I ensure that the practices that I've brought to my organization are sustained beyond me as an individual? And when we're thinking about news organizations, what we don't often have at a grassroots level, or when the media are kind of coming up, or your three people in a bedroom with a podcast, whatever it is right. So what are the rules we're going to put in place so that this thing endures beyond us, and that the practices, that the values we have endures beyond us? And what Impress does is it says, we're a very broad church. We are very agnostic to what are the worldviews that inform your journalism, but we say here are some fundamentals, and if you've got these fundamentals in place, you will be able to professionalize, and you will be able to endure. These systems will endure beyond the three people that have started this thing, and ensure that your journalism has legacy. So that looks like things like we require people to have policies in place. We require you have nominated individuals performing roles. And importantly, we require deep engagement with your audience community. So that means being responsive. And that is very different to what media have been required to do in this country for time immemorial, right? And so our approach to grassroots journalism is to say, put these little foundational practices in place, and you will find that no matter where your organization goes, how it grows, how it changes, this stuff will keep you within these guardrails. and we think that works.
Yeah.
We've seen it work. We've seen hundreds of news organisations come in and out of Impress, all different models, all different missions, but the singular, the centrifugal force that binds them is these practices, these ethics practices, these governance practices that they put in place, and they can all do it. So I know that any organisation that wants to can, and that no matter the size or shape of what you're trying to do, these things can work.
Absolutely. And I think with those rules put in place, like those policies, you're actually going to make them legitimate sources of knowledge. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing. And I think particularly in a time where there is so much exclusion of minoritized voices, but particularly those that come from very, very small, independent outlets or organizations. But we live in a really, really like unpredictable time as is in terms of digital harm. And you do discuss the challenges of unregulated digital spaces. I think particularly around children's exposure to things that are quite dangerous. And I think the stats at the moment are showing that kids are being exposed to things at incredibly young ages. So how can regulators and society as a whole help to mitigate that proliferation of harm that's happening to particularly like quite vulnerable people, but young people whose minds are being shaped so much by the things that they see within the digital sphere?
Yeah. So again, this comes back to this idea. So this idea of regulation, I think, can be a little bit inaccessible at times. But what we're talking about fundamentally is a group of people coming together and saying these are the sets of rules that we think should apply here, whether this is this digital space, this physical space, and we're going to uphold those, and we're going to ensure that there's a culture of upholding those rules. Right? That's what regulation is. It's not a big, scary ivory tower thing. And when it comes to the way that people have engaged with digital spaces, so think about those early times of the internet. When I was coming up, as a teenager, I was on that weird cusp of like a pre and post like digital experience, and so I saw both sides of it, and the harms that kids are experiencing now, we were experiencing, way back when, but there wasn't a sort of space to clarify that was going on, and now there is a lot more advocacy and a lot more movement building around redressing those harms that have taken place. And so, what does that look like? I suggest that any community online can create their own rule sets for that. The trouble is that the way the big tech market power has accumulated is that often those spaces are dominated by the controlling rule sets of the owner of that platform, whatever that is. So if we think about, on Meta, for example, if you're on WhatsApp, Instagram, or Facebook, there are different rule sets governing those. And you don't necessarily know as a user what the rule set is when you're going into it. Yeah, there's like a long page, 10,000 word document of policies, but what's the cultural understanding of what you're going into that rule set? And then at the whims of the owner could change, because when Twitter was bought and turned into X, the owner changed the rule set, and so what are my expectations now going into that space? And so what I would love to see is more civil movements taking back power in digital and online spaces to define their own rule sets, not necessarily rely on the government to come in and apply a bunch of rule sets as well, but to say, all right, so this is how I understand we're going to behave. This is the level playing field. This is the redress that's going to happen when things go wrong. And for kids to be part of that conversation, because they are equal stakeholders in the opportunities and outcomes of those spaces as well. And unfortunately, we don't let kids participate in democracy. But the imagining of digital spaces as kids could. And so again, the methodologies that we've approached and previously in my work, I think could easily apply. So can you imagine, a kind of a video streaming service for kids, designed by kids with rule sets in there, that their guardians, their educators, their communities are part of building, and that really decentralized approach to regulation is something I think is really exciting, and it's it's just the opportunity for all of us to do something like that.
Absolutely. I really love that answer, because I think at the heart of all of that is media justice, and I think if we are trying to mandate accountability in the things that we do online, we will better protect those that deserve protecting in society. And I think everyone is deserving of protection. And that kind of touches on how you would want these structural changes and these like empathetic changes too. And I think you lead your work with empathy, which is such a unique thing to find. But that kind of, I think my final question to you would be like, well, what actually drew you to this work in the first place, like on a more personal level? Because I think at the heart of everything you're saying, like again, obviously empathy is there, and you want to see these structural changes, but at the heart of what you do as well is anti-racism advocacy and it's media justice. So there's so many themes that are coming out of the things that you're saying. But how do you? So what drew you to this work, and how do you maintain clarity and conviction in something that is so clouded sometimes?
I think it's one of those things, as I said before, it's this idea of kind of there's rule breaking involved in some of this as well, because the norms that I grew up with, the cultural norms that I grew up with, look, I trained as a lawyer, I really believed in law as like this vehicle for justice that, look, here's this group of rules, and if we're all supposed to follow them, and if something bad happens, then someone, a white knight, a state white knight swoops in and solves that problem. And then you move out into the world and you're like, oh, none of that applies. There's all sorts of other interests, captured interests that sit behind what rule sets get enforced or not. And yeah, and from a personal story perspective, from my background, and my experiences in the world, you see harm everywhere, and if you just are in relation to people, you can see their pains, their struggles, and what I love about the work that I get to do is I get to connect with other people and I get to understand their story. And through that, and after many years of building this work, it's you can't ignore what's going on out there, that the level of injustice that's going on out there, and so that's really driving for me. And I've never felt the kind of a sense of pressure or a chill around the work that we do, because it's just the right thing to do, and we've tried a lot of methodologies over the last 20 to 50 years to try and get move into this value space beyond sort of utilitarianism and into communitarianism and all these sorts of things. And at the end of the day, we just have to know when something's broken. Something's too broken to fix, right? And you go, right, so what's the next transition? What are we going to try on the alternative? And when I think about news media, when I think about access to justice and the interplay of these different systems that we all have to participate in, I do think genuinely the social contract's broken. So because of that, I don't think the rules apply. And if the rules don't apply, that creates like a big blue sky for you to be like, oh, wow, we can actually do things differently. And so that's what drives me. Like that's what sits behind my conviction. That's what sits behind my belief. There's not like a single moment. I don't think there wasn't like a turning point when like the empathy light bulb switched on.
No.
But as I said, the my passion comes from connecting with people, and when it comes to news media in particular, everyone has such an important relationship to it, because as I said before, it's about the story we tell about ourselves, and everyone wants to be a proprietor of the story that we tell about ourselves. So every single person has a stake in that, and every single person should have an opportunity to participate in that. And our current media structures and hegemonies don't allow that to happen. But what we're seeing is this really great groundswell where people are creating new media. There has been a democratizing effect where people have access to tell their own stories and build affinity. And what we're actually seeing is that's where people are gravitating towards. So until we reconcile that that's what's going on, and learn the lessons from where people are starting to consume their news now and where they're going to experience news and be storytellers themselves, then that's to me where the new interesting stuff is happening, and that's the place I want to be as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that passion seeps through, and it honestly is inspiring to see. And I am in awe of you and the things that you've achieved, because honestly, it's incredible. It really is. I mean, the fact that you're a CEO of you've created this whole movement, and at the heart of it, like we said earlier, is this wanting to centre the community at the heart of everything that you do. And I think that sort of empathy-led approach is what's going to make, like, I don't know, just these things succeed as a whole. So I'm thankful that I've been able to share this space with you. So yeah, I'm really thankful for that. And obviously with your background as well, international media, law and the anti-racism advocacy, there is no reason why people cannot see that and want to emulate that or be a part of that. So I'm hoping that will be the future of just like the media organisations as a whole. But maybe it's a utopian ideal, because sometimes it's quite hard to deconstruct these systems that we've lived in for such a long time. And I think I always used to say that the system's not broken; it's working exactly the way it's supposed to, where they want inequality to strive. But the system in and of itself is a broken system that allow people to thrive in the way that they deserve to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, and thank you very much for the compliment. You can tell I'm really good at taking them. But I think that the point is, I also think it's about the visibility of it.
Okay.
Like, I coming up in my career, it was like I was always looking for those role models. I was looking for those leadership styles that felt really resonant to me, and I was like, oh, if I just kind of like mimic these, then that's what being like a leader
Absolutely.
is. And what I've sort of found since is actually like I stand in the shadow of my ancestors that have long since been before me, and and in the shadow of my descendants that will come after. And what I hope to do is not be an anomaly or a blip, but rather again just a vehicle for again rights building, communitarianism building, all of this in the justice work that we do, and so that whoever will be the next CEO of Impress, like the CEOs before me who taught me what I know, it will be maintained far beyond that. And again, that's the kind of lessons we want to apply to the news media as well. Is that this is about legacy. This isn't about the brand in the moment, and so what can we do to build that and make sure that that's maintained? Because for me, a big part of it is like some part of the problems that we see in the media around is really about that leadership and governance, and the fact that who was willing to pass that torch when they recognised they'd come to the end of their road, their limits, and that they needed to bring in new ideas and fresh thinking or a new way of doing things. And we're seeing were a lot of blockages to that, right? There's a lot of gatekeeping. So I don't pretend that I have all the answers to everything, or that there isn't way more learning for me to do, because there is absolutely. But again, that comes from being in relationship to other people, and so that's again what keeps me tethered to this work. Is like I know there's so much more for me to learn, for me to improve on, for me to bring into this space, and I've got the grace and the privilege to be able to do that in the position that I occupy now, and I hope to be able to create that for other people as well. So that's what drives me from that perspective.
Yeah, you might not have all the answers, but you certainly have excellent answers. And thank you so much for your time, Lexi. It's been absolutely incredible. And that's Lexi Kavana, incredible CEO of Impress. And it's been an honour being able to interview her at the Media Democracy Festival. So thank you so much.